Hi everyone. Welcome back to our channel, where stories aren't just told, they're felt. If you're someone who believes in empathy, justice, and truth, you're in the right place. Two elderly black grandparents just walking home with a bag of apples and bread, when flashing lights, cold handcuffs, and a false accusation turned their quiet morning into a nightmare. But what the officers didn't know, these two hold the evidence that could bring down an entire system, and now the whole city is watching. Before we get into the full story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. If this story touched something in you, if it opened your eyes, stirred your heart, or simply made you pause, we invite you to leave a meaningful response. And if you feel the story missed a layer, lacked context, or could speak deeper truths, share your perspective in the comments. Your support helps us bring more real voices, raw truths, and honest conversations to light. Every click counts, and every story matters. Now let's begin. It was supposed to be a morning like any other, quiet and unremarkable. The kind of morning you never expect to remember. The streets of Charleston, South Carolina, still held the weight of dawn, a faint mist curling low along the sidewalks as the city began to stir. Levi and Clara Jackson, a couple married for nearly 50 years, stepped out of their weathered townhouse with two canvas bags in hand, their pace slow but steady. Levi's back was straight. Despite his age, Clara's hand resting lightly on his arm, their movements synchronized the way couples move when life has taught them patience and resilience. They weren't rushing, because at 79 and 76, they knew rushing never led to anywhere worth going. The walk to the market was their ritual. 3 blocks of cracked pavement lined with ancient oaks, whose roots had buckled the sidewalk Spanish moss, swaying like gentle ghosts overhead. The morning air smelled of salt and warm earth, the sound of distant gulls drifting in from the harbor. They passed neighbors who waved, without needing words, a boy on a bicycle who called out "Morning, Mr. Jackson," and a postal worker who nodded with a smile. Everything about that walk spoke of routine, of a life carved out quietly in a city that had seen too many storms, but somehow always found calm again. But calm can shatter without warning. They were 2 blocks from home, grocery bags filled with apples, onions, and a loaf of fresh bread, when Clara noticed at first the sound of a car engine idling low and deliberate like a predator breathing. A black and white patrol cruiser sat at the corner, lights off, windows down. Neither of them recognized it. The officers inside weren't the ones who usually patrolled their neighborhood. This car was newer, shinier, its presence humming like an unanswered question. Levi slowed his step, his hand tightening just slightly around the bag strap. It wasn't fear, not yet. It was a flicker of memory, the kind that doesn't surface easily, but grips you when it does. He remembered other uniforms, in other times, moments, when protection was a privilege reserved for someone else, and suspicion was the only thing men like him were offered freely. Clara sensed it too. Her fingers tightened around his arm. But they kept walking, each step measured, steady, like people who know too well that sudden movements can be mistaken for something they're not. Then came the voice, flat, sharp, and heavy with something unspoken. "Sir, ma'am, stop right there." They stopped, turned slowly the way you do when you're trying to keep the air from cracking open. Levi's eyes met the mirrored sunglasses of the officer stepping out, a man in his 30s with a jaw tight enough to splinter glass. His hand hovered near his belt, not quite on his holster, but close enough to make its presence loud. The younger officer on the other side, barely more than a rookie, shifted uneasily his fingers, brushing the edge of his own badge, like he wasn't sure if it meant anything anymore. "We got a report," the older officer said, his tone clipped. "Someone matching your description carrying a weapon." Levi blinked. The mist around them seemed to thicken, pulling the world into a strange, tense stillness. He looked down at the bags, lifted one slightly so the apples inside shifted and knocked together with a soft, hollow thud. "You mean these?" he asked, voice calm, low unshaken. Clara glanced at him, then at the officers, her grip tightening on the loaf of bread like it might somehow anchor them to the ordinary. The younger officer muttered, "It's probably nothing," but the older one didn't flinch. His voice cut through the air, leaving no space for questions. "Put the bags down. Step back. Hands where I can see them." It wasn't the words. It was the way they were said, not as a request, but as a verdict. Clara's breath hitched just once, but she didn't speak. Levi bent down slowly, his knees protesting, and placed the bags carefully on the cracked sidewalk. The world seemed to hold its breath. The cuffs came fast. Too fast. Cold steel against sun-warmed skin wrists yanked back with a practiced motion that didn't care who they were, only what they looked like in that moment. Clara cried out, not loud, but enough for the younger officer to hesitate. For a second his eyes met hers, and in that second there was doubt. But doubt doesn't stop the script once it's started. Neighbors began to appear on porches, their faces pale and uncertain phones raised, but voices muted by the weight of shock. Spanish moss drifted lazily in the breeze, soft and indifferent, as two lives were bound and bent into the back of a waiting cruiser. Their groceries sat abandoned on the sidewalk apples, rolling slowly toward the gutter, the bread resting against the curb like some fragile casualty. Levi and Clara didn't resist, didn't shout, didn't plead. They sat in silence as the cruiser door shut the world outside, reduced to a muffled hum. For them, silence wasn't surrender, it was survival. A survival honed over decades, through wars, marches, losses, and promises the world never kept. And what the officers didn't know, not yet, was that this quiet couple they'd just thrown into the shadows of suspicion weren't just ordinary residents of Charleston. Levi was a decorated veteran Clara, a retired community organizer, and together they were the linchpin in a federal case that, if broken open, could topple a system far larger than the two men who had just cuffed them. What followed wouldn't just rattle the streets of Charleston, it would shake its foundations. The holding cell was colder than the Charleston morning outside, not because of the temperature, but because of the stillness. The walls, a dull beige, meant to calm instead, carried the weight of a place designed to erase the color of human lives. Levi sat on the hard bench with his back pressed straight, his knees aching from the force that had bent them on the sidewalk. Clara sat across from him, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her breath steady even though her chest still burned from the shock of how fast it had all unraveled. Neither spoke at first. There was nothing to say, and besides, they both understood the cost of words in a place where even silence could be used against you. It wasn't fear that filled the space between them. It was something heavier, an old familiar disbelief, the kind that settles in the bones of people who have lived long enough to know how easily dignity can be stripped away, even after you've done everything right. Clara watched Levi's face. His jaw set, his eyes calm, but fixed on the scuffed tile floor, as if searching for something beneath it. She knew that look. She had seen it before decades ago, when he came back from his second tour in Vietnam, bruised not from battle, but from the welcome he received on streets that promised gratitude but delivered suspicion. Back then, She had told him, "You don't have to shout to be heard, Levi. You just have to outlast the noise." He had taken those words and carried them like a shield ever since. The silence broke not with a bang, but with the soft buzz of a phone from somewhere beyond the steel door. A deputy's voice murmured in the hallway, clipped and tense, followed by another. Then faintly, the sound of a woman's voice, sharper, firmer. "I saw it all. I have it on video. You can't bury this." The words drifted into the cell, like smoke, faint but undeniable. Clara's eyes met Levi's. She didn't smile, but there was the slightest flicker of something in her gaze recognition. For all the years they'd spent weathering storms in silence, maybe this time someone else would speak. Minutes later, the door opened and Deputy Rowe, the younger one, the one whose eyes had faltered on the street, stepped inside. His face was pale, his jaw tight, but his posture had softened like someone who had begun to feel the weight of his own choices. He didn't look at them directly at first, just at the floor, before clearing his throat. "Mr. and Mrs. Jackson," he said quietly, "there's a video. Someone across the street filmed everything." His voice wavered, not from fear, but from something close to shame. It's spreading fast. They're saying the two of you were targeted, that you were hurt. People are asking questions." Levi didn't answer immediately. He looked up, his eyes steady, and asked the only thing that mattered. "Are they listening?" Rowe hesitated. "They're watching," he said. And the words carried both promise and warning. By the time the Jacksons were led uncuffed into the narrow corridor that connected the holding cell to the front of the sheriff's office, the atmosphere in the building had changed. Phones were ringing without pause. Voices rose and fell like a tide, urgent but muted, as if the deputies knew the world outside had begun to peer in through every window. Through the glass doors, Clara could see a small group gathering across the street. Neighbors, church members, a few strangers who had probably seen the video before they'd even had their morning coffee. None of them shouted. They just stood, holding signs, scrawled with quick, uneven letters, "We know them. Do you?" The sheriff, a broad-shouldered man named Dean, with a starched shirt and a brow furrowed deeper than usual, met them in the briefing room. His words, polished and measured, slid off the table like condensation. "There appears to have been a misunderstanding." He began, his tone carrying the kind of bureaucratic calm designed to soothe without admitting anything. Clara's fingers tapped once against her knee, not out of impatience, but to keep herself from speaking the truth too quickly. Levi, however, leaned forward just slightly, his voice even, but unyielding. "This isn't a misunderstanding, Sheriff. This is a pattern. And patterns don't break because someone calls them by another name." Before Dean could reply, the door opened again, and a woman stepped in. Brenda Lattimore, the neighbor who had filmed it all. She wasn't loud, wasn't theatrical. She simply set her phone on the table screen, lit the footage, paused on a frame of Levi kneeling on the cracked asphalt, Clara's hand raised as if to shield him from a world that hadn't cared to listen. "You need to see this," she said, her voice steady but sharp as glass. "And you need to understand, people have already seen it. You can't undo what's out there." Dean's composure faltered just slightly, but Levi and Clara didn't look at him. They looked at Brenda, at the woman whose voice had cut through the silence when it mattered most. Clara spoke first, her voice soft, but carrying the weight of decades. "Thank you," she said. "Not for filming. for not looking away. The tension in the room shifted. Rowe cleared his throat, stepped forward, and for the first time since the cuffs had closed, looked Levi in the eye. "Sir," he said, his voice quiet but deliberate, I should have said something. I knew it didn't feel right." Levi's expression didn't soften, but his reply was simple. "Then say it now. To them. To anyone who will listen. That's how this stops." Outside, the murmurs had grown into something steadier, not shouting, but a collective hum of presence. Church bells from St. Philip's chimed noon, their echoes stretching across the cobblestones like a reminder that time doesn't pause for anyone, not even the truth. Clara stood beside Levi as the sheriff finally opened the doors, the sunlight spilling into the station's lobby. The small crowd turned as the Jacksons stepped out, not with cheers, but with the quiet respect of people who understand that the real noise was just beginning. For the first time that morning, Levi let his shoulders relax just slightly. Clara's hand found his, her fingers curling around his, with the kind of strength that only grows after years of weathering storms together. They didn't speak as they stepped onto the sidewalk, the sounds of cameras clicking somewhere in the distance, the murmurs of neighbors, the distant rush of the harbor wind. The silence had broken. Not with anger, not with chaos, but with something stronger, the weight of too many eyes now watching to let this moment vanish. And deep down, Levi knew this wasn't the end of their reckoning. It was only the first ripple of a wave that would test whether the city and everyone watching beyond it was finally ready to listen. The sun dipped lower over Charleston as Levi and Clara Jackson sat at their kitchen table, the day's weight still clinging to them like humidity after a storm. The television was off the blinds, half drawn, and the only sound in the house was the soft creak of wood as the old ceiling fan spun lazily above them. Clara's hands rested on the smooth grain of the table, her fingers tapping a slow rhythm that matched the quiet thud of her pulse. Levi stared at his folded military ID lying on the table's edge. The lamination had yellowed with time, the corners frayed, but the photo, the man in uniform steady-eyed, still stared back like a reminder of everything the world pretended not to know. Outside, the city was beginning to stir. The video of their arrest, Brenda's footage, had already torn through social media like a spark catching dry leaves. By nightfall, local news outlets had begun replaying it on a loop, the cracked asphalt, Levi's stoic silence as the cuffs clicked into place, Clara's voice trembling, but unbroken, as she demanded to know why. It wasn't just anger that spread with the clip. It was something heavier, more complicated, the quiet grief of people who had seen this story before, in different faces, in different cities, and wondered how many times the same wound could reopen before it finally scarred over. Levi finally reached for the ID, slipping it back into his wallet as he muttered almost to himself, 31 years serving this country. But somehow, I'm still just another suspect on my own street. Clara's eyes lifted to meet his. You were never just another suspect, Levi. They know that now. And if they don't, they're about to. Her voice carried no tremor, just the calm certainty of a woman who had spent her youth standing in protest lines, her hands clasped with strangers as dogs barked and batons swung. Clara had learned long ago that rage alone burned out too quickly. Resolve, though, that lasted. Neither of them heard the car until it slowed in front of their house. Levi glanced through the blinds, his gaze settling on two black SUVs with tinted windows idling by the curb. They weren't local. The engines hummed low, deliberate, as two figures emerged, one tall, lean, in a dark suit. The other shorter, broad-shouldered, his posture steady and deliberate. Their shoes weren't made for Charleston's cracked sidewalks, and their presence carried a quiet finality. Levi didn't move, just murmured Federal. Clara's hand rested gently on his arm. Then it's bigger than we thought. Minutes later, Special Agents Donovan Reeves and Elena Marquez from the Department of Justice were sitting in their living room. They didn't waste words. Reeves, his voice low and measured, placed a manila folder on the table. Mr. Jackson, Mrs. Jackson. What happened to you two wasn't just a bad arrest. It compromised an ongoing investigation. For 6 months, you've been quietly helping us document misconduct across 3 counties. That arrest, it didn't just hurt you. It jeopardized everything we've built. Clara's brow furrowed, her hands tightening around each other. We didn't ask for this, she said softly, but there was steel beneath her tone. We didn't ask to become anyone's evidence. Marquez leaned forward, her dark eyes steady. We know. But you agreed to help because you believed, even after everything you've lived through, that the truth still matters. Now it's out there, whether we wanted it or not. And we need to make a choice. Either we let this become just another viral outrage, or we use it to crack something open for good. Levi studied them, his silence heavy, but not empty. His mind flicked back to memories. He rarely spoke of his return from Vietnam, when men spat at him in airports. The way Clara had stood between him and a baton during a march in Birmingham in 1968, whispering, "Breathe, Levi. Outlast them." He thought about the neighbors who had stood outside the station that morning, silent but unmoving, their presence like a tide slowly eroding a wall. And then he thought about the deputies, their faces, their hesitations, their choices. What happens, he asked finally, his voice deep and deliberate, if we push? What happens if we don't just survive this, but make them answer for every man and woman they've done this to before us? Reeves met his gaze without flinching. It gets dangerous, he said simply. People will push back. They'll dig into your life, your past, your service, looking for something to smear you with. They'll say you provoked it, that you're just angry, that you don't represent anyone but yourself. Clara straightened in her chair, her spine as rigid as the pews she sat on every Sunday. Let them try, she said. I've buried too many friends, marched too many miles, and watched too many mothers cry to sit quiet now. If they think 2 old folks can't make noise, they're in for a surprise. Marquez's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but carried a spark of respect. Then we'll make sure you're protected. But you need to understand, this isn't just about Rust Creek or Charleston anymore. You're not just witnesses. You're the case now, and people are watching. That night, as the agents left and the SUVs pulled away into the dark, Clara stood on the porch beside Levi, the cicadas singing their endless hymn in the trees. The neighborhood was quiet but not still. Shadows moved in windows across the street, neighbors checking, listening, waiting. Levi's gaze followed the red glow of the tail lights until it disappeared. Then he spoke almost as if confessing something he'd held too long. I'm tired, Clara. Not of fighting. Just tired of proving over and over who we are. She reached for his hand, her grip firm. Then this time, Levi, we don't just prove. We make them remember. Somewhere, a car engine backfired, and the sound made the air feel taut, like a wire pulled too tight. The Jacksons turned toward the door, stepping back into the glow of their kitchen light. The world outside was awake now, watching, questioning, demanding. And as Levi locked the door behind them, the thought lingered in the quiet space between them. The real fault lines weren't the streets or the station walls. They were deeper, older, running through every corner of a country, still trying to decide if it would ever see them for who they truly were. The cracks had been exposed, and now there was no turning back. The first signs of change came not with shouting, but with silence. Charleston's streets usually filled with the easy hum of conversation, and the distant sound of waves rolling against the pier grew heavier with each passing hour. Outside, the Charleston Police Department folding chairs began appearing in neat rows. By the end of the day, there were nearly 100 people sitting shoulder to shoulder, their faces still, their gazes locked on the glass doors like they were waiting for the building itself to breathe. They weren't holding signs or chanting slogans. The stillness was their message, and that somehow felt louder than any march. Clara Jackson stood among them, her hands folded gently in front of her, her frame steady despite the ache in her knees. She hadn't stood in a line like this since the late 60s, when she and other women locked arms outside a courthouse in Montgomery and dared anyone to move them. The memory rippled through her as she caught the eye of a young woman nearby, no older than 20, holding a phone but not recording, simply watching. Clara offered her a small nod, the kind of gesture that says, "This is bigger than us, but we're here together." Inside the building, Sheriff Alan Dean stood by the blinds of his office, looking down at the growing crowd. His reflection in the glass made him appear smaller, blurred, as if even the window couldn't decide whether he belonged on this side of the story or theirs. Deputy Aaron Elrod stood just behind him, his posture stiff, his jaw tight. "They're not leaving," Sir Elrod said softly. Dean didn't respond, only tightened his grip on the blinds before letting them snap shut. The tension in his shoulders said more than words. This wasn't a storm he could outwait. By mid-afternoon, news vans lined the street, their antennas stabbing the gray sky like impatient fingers. Cameras pointed toward the quiet crowd, catching faces weathered by decades and others still smooth with youth. Among them, veterans in faded jackets stood side by side with pastors' college students and mothers balancing toddlers on their hips. A young boy, no older than 12, held a cardboard sign scrawled in uneven letters, "Respect is not optional." The weight of the words hung heavier than their size. Levi Jackson hadn't wanted to come, but Clara insisted. They arrived quietly, walking down the sidewalk at a measured pace, the low hum of conversations tapering as people noticed them. No one swarmed. No one cheered. They simply made space a path, opening naturally until the Jacksons reached the front line of chairs. Clara sat her spine straight, her hands resting on her lap. Levi remained standing for a moment, scanning the faces, the officers watching from behind the glass, the cameras lingering on every breath. Then, with the kind of calm that comes only from years of learning how to be seen without flinching, he sat beside her. From the doorway, Deputy Elrod watched them settle in. The image of Levi from the cruiser's dash cam flickered in his mind, the man's steady breath as the cuffs bit into his wrists, the way Clara's voice trembled but didn't break. Elrod exhaled slowly, feeling the familiar churn in his gut. "Feels like we owe them something," he muttered to no one in particular. Caroline, from the front desk standing a few feet away, heard him but didn't answer. Instead, she looked at the line of people outside her eyes, resting on Clara, and felt the air shift not like chaos, but like gravity, tilting just slightly towards something inevitable. The first sound to cut through the stillness wasn't a chant or a shout, but the sharp, rhythmic click of shoes on the pavement. Reverend Holloway had arrived, his Bible tucked beneath one arm, his other hand resting on the shoulder of a teenage boy walking beside him. He didn't take the pulpit this time. He simply joined the front row, nodding once to Levi and Clara before lowering himself into a chair. His presence carried the weight of decades, the unspoken reminder that they had stood before in the face of something bigger than themselves, and they could stand again. As dusk settled over the street, the station's windows reflected the glow of the news cameras, the soft golden wash of streetlights, and the still bodies of those who refused to leave. A breeze swept through, rustling the edges of the handmade signs and lifting the faint smell of magnolia from a nearby tree. Inside, Sheriff Dean closed his office door with a dull click, the sound echoing faintly down the hall. Outside, Clara reached for Levi's hand and whispered, "This time we're not walking away." The street held its breath, and for the first time since the arrest, it felt like the city itself was listening. The air inside the Charleston County Courthouse felt heavy, like the weight of the past weeks had seeped into the walls. The rows of benches were filled not with reporters or protesters, but with neighbors, veterans, and families who had all found their lives tied to the story of Levi and Clara Jackson. It wasn't a trial that had brought them here, at least not the kind with juries and lawyers, but a hearing that would decide what came next, whether the arrest that rattled this city would be remembered as a mistake brushed aside, or the moment the system finally listened. Levi sat with his hands folded loosely in his lap, his posture calm but unyielding. The bruises on his wrists had faded but not completely faint shadows of the morning, when he was treated like a suspect instead of a man walking home with groceries beside his wife. Clara sat next to him, her fingers lightly brushing his arm, grounding him in a way words never could. Her own arrest had left her back aching for days, but what lingered longer than the pain was the echo of silence, the way no one had questioned what was being done to them until a stranger lifted a phone and hit record. At the front of the room, Special Agent Donovan Reeves stood his charcoal suit, cutting a sharp line against the dull wood of the chamber. Beside him, Agent Marquez held a slim folder, her gaze sweeping the room with quiet precision. They hadn't come for spectacle. They'd come to close a chapter. Reeves cleared his throat, his voice measured, but firm, carrying the weight of a decision not up for debate. The Department of Justice has concluded its review of the events involving Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, he began. His eyes moved deliberately to the deputies seated across the aisle. Timmons, with his jaw tight and his arms crossed. Elrod sitting straighter than usual, but with his gaze low. It is the finding of this office that excessive force was used without just cause, resulting not only in a violation of civil rights, but a direct compromise of an ongoing federal investigation. His words landed like a slow drumbeat, each one settling into the quiet before the next followed. Reeves glanced down at the folder, then back at the room. Effective immediately. Officer Timmons is terminated from his position and will face formal charges for civil rights violations. Deputy Elrod will be suspended without pay and placed under federal review for his failure to intervene. Sheriff Dean's office will operate under DOJ oversight until further notice. A murmur rippled through the benches, restrained but undeniable, the sound of relief mingled with the sting of knowing it had taken federal intervention for justice to take its first breath. Clara didn't move, didn't exhale. She kept her eyes forward, her hand tightening slightly around Levi's arm. She had stood through decades of empty promises, seen the way apologies often served as the final word instead of the first step. This she sensed could not be just another press release in a stack of forgotten ones. Then Reeves turned to them, his voice softening. "Mr. and Mrs. Jackson, the department thanks you for your cooperation and your restraint. Both of you have served not just this country, but your community with dignity. The acknowledgement of your role as federal witnesses will be formally documented." He reached into the folder and withdrew 2 envelopes, handing one to Levi and the other to Clara. No medals, no applause, just 2 pieces of paper, heavy with what they had endured and what the world could no longer deny. Levi accepted his envelope with steady hands, his gaze lingering on Reeves for a moment before nodding once. "Paper doesn't fix what's broken." He set his voice, deep but calm, the kind of tone that carried to the back of the room without strain. "But it can make sure people don't forget." Reeves met his eyes and returned the nod. "That's why we're here," he said quietly. When the hearing adjourned, no one rushed for the exits. People stayed seated watching as Levi and Clara stood slowly side by side, their movements deliberate. They didn't wave or speak to the cameras outside the courthouse doors. They didn't need to. As they stepped into the sunlight, the crowd lining the steps began to clap, not loud, not chaotic, but a slow, steady rhythm that rose like a tide. Levi paused at the top of the stairs, feeling the warm air brush against his face, and looked over at Clara. "Ready to go home?" he asked softly. She nodded, her eyes glinting with something between exhaustion and resolve. "Home's waiting," she said, her voice firm, despite the tremor of emotion beneath it. They walked down the courthouse steps at the same pace they had walked down their street that morning, weeks ago, hands brushing gently, neither one needing to speak. Behind them, the applause carried on, and ahead of them the street opened wide, the late afternoon light spilling across the pavement like a promise. It wasn't victory, not yet, but it was a beginning. And for Levi and Clara Jackson, that was enough to keep walking, this time without fear, this time with the city watching, not to judge, but to understand. Levi and Clara Jackson's story began as something unbearably ordinary. A married couple in their 70s, walking home from the Charleston farmers market, hands full of groceries and hearts full of nothing more than the comfort of routine. But what should have been just another quiet afternoon became a flashpoint, a moment that ripped away the illusion of safety they had worked a lifetime to build. Their arrest wasn't just about 2 people thrown to the ground without cause. It was about a history that refuses to stay buried. A reminder that even those who have given their lives to service and community can still find themselves treated as less than human. For days, their voices were silent, not by choice, but because silence was the only armor they had, while the world tried to decide whether their pain mattered. Yet as the footage spread and their truth could no longer be ignored, their story stopped being about just one couple. It became a mirror reflecting the uncomfortable truths that so many have carried but never spoken aloud. Strangers who had never met them began to recognize themselves in their struggle, not because they had all walked the same road, but because the injustice Levi and Clara endured was a wound that resonated far beyond one city or one incident. What followed was not a sweeping revolution, not a tidal wave of instant change. Instead, it was something slower, deeper, and perhaps more lasting. A teenage girl with a cracked phone captured the video that gave the Jackson story wings. Neighbors who once kept to themselves showed up on courthouse steps and sidewalks, not shouting, but standing, proving that solidarity doesn't always need a megaphone. Veterans who had walked other battlefields saluted the couple, not because they were symbols, but because they were people whose dignity had been trampled and yet remained unbroken. And through it all, Levi and Clara never screamed, never sought the spotlight. They simply stood shoulder to shoulder, unflinching, letting their calm, steady presence speak louder than any words ever could. They reminded everyone watching that strength is not always in the noise we make, but in the stillness we hold when the world tries to shake us. Their composure didn't just win sympathy, it demanded respect. The lesson we can carry from their story is not just about injustice or even resilience, it's about choice. Levi and Clara showed us that we cannot control the storms life throws our way, but we can choose how we stand in the rain. They could have met cruelty with anger, but they chose steadiness. They could have stayed silent, even after the truth surfaced, but they chose to speak, not to shout down their oppressors, but to tell the world, see us, remember us, learn from this. In our own lives, we will face moments big or small where we're tested. Maybe it's a workplace where your value is overlooked. Maybe it's a community where voices like yours are dismissed. Or maybe it's something as simple yet as difficult as standing beside someone else when they're the ones being pushed down. Levi and Clara's story teaches us that justice doesn't only live in courtrooms or headlines. It lives in the courage to keep standing, in the willingness to speak truth, even when it's uncomfortable, and in the strength to demand dignity without losing your own humanity. So as you sit with this story, ask yourself, what will you do the next time you see someone silenced? Will you look away, or will you stand with them? Will you choose comfort, or will you choose courage? Because real change doesn't come from waiting for the world to fix itself. It comes from ordinary people refusing to accept the unacceptable. If Levi and Clara's journey moved you, if it reminded you that the fight for respect and justice is not just history, but our present, we invite you to take action in the simplest way you can. Like this video, to help more people hear their story, share it with someone who needs to understand that quiet strength can move mountains. And most importantly, subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the drive to keep telling stories like this, stories that don't just inform, but inspire, stories that make sure voices like Levi and Clara's are never forgotten. Because if there's one thing their story proves, it's this: silence can be broken, dignity can endure, and together we can make sure that no one ever has to stand alone.